For a lot of AI companies, August 2026 is the month the fun part ended and the workflow part began. That is not because AI stopped moving fast. If anything, AI is moving faster than ever. New tools keep showing up. Chatbots keep spreading into customer support, sales, search, editing, education, and internal work, and AI-generated images, videos, and voices are now part of everyday internet culture. What changed is that one of the world's biggest regulators just moved from talking about transparency to enforcing it. On August 2, 2026, the European Commission started enforcing the next major layer of the EU AI Act, and for a huge number of products, the most immediate part is not some distant high-risk industries rule. It is Article 50, the transparency rules. That sounds abstract, but the practical meaning is simple. If people are interacting with AI, or looking at certain AI-generated or AI-manipulated content, companies can no longer treat disclosure as a nice-to-have detail. This is now real product work, and that is why this story matters even if you are not a lawyer, not in Europe, and not building a frontier model, because the companies that will feel this first are not only giant labs, they are app teams, marketing teams, support teams, creator tools, avatar products, workflow tools, publishing systems, and any business that put AI into something customers or audiences actually touch. So let us break down what changed, what the rules are really trying to do, and why this is less about courtroom drama and more about interface design, content pipelines, and operational discipline. The first important point is timing. The European Commission said on July 31, 2026 that from August 2, 2026, its AI office and national authorities would begin enforcing the AI Act rules that are now due, alongside new transparency requirements. Then the Commission published and surfaced supporting guidance explaining how those transparency obligations should be understood in practice. So this is not a future date people can keep pushing off. In absolute terms, the switch happened on August 2, 2026. As of today, Sunday, August 16, 2026, those obligations are already live. The second important point is scope. People hear AI Act and often assume it mostly means advanced model providers or highly regulated sectors like medicine, hiring, or policing. Those parts matter, but Article 50 is much broader in the sense that it touches the most common consumer and business-facing AI behaviors. The Commission's guidance says Article 50 applies to certain AI systems including interactive AI systems, generative AI outputs, and deepfakes. The Commission FAQ goes even more direct. It says providers of systems that interact directly with people, including chatbots, AI agents, and avatars, must make sure people are informed that they are interacting with AI. That means the friendly assistant inside your product is no longer just a design question. The moment it talks like a person, answers like a person, or behaves like a digital helper, the disclosure question becomes part of the product requirement. And that is only half of it. The other half is about content. According to the Commission FAQ, providers of generative AI systems must ensure outputs are marked with machine-readable signals that make the content detectable as AI-generated or AI-manipulated. That is a different standard from simply slapping visible text on an image. It means the transparency layer has to travel with the content in a way systems can detect. Then there is the deployer side. The Commission makes a distinction between providers and deployers. Providers are the entities developing or placing the AI system on the market under their own name. Deployers are the organizations or people using those systems under their authority, outside purely personal use. That distinction matters because a lot of companies like to think compliance belongs upstream. They want the model vendor or platform vendor to solve everything. But Article 50 does not let everyone hide behind the provider. Deployers have their own obligations too. The FAQ explains that deployers must clearly label deepfakes and certain AI-generated or manipulated text published on matters of public interest when that content goes out without human review or editorial control. In other words, it is not only about who made the tool, it is also about who used the tool and how the content was actually released. That changes the conversation completely, because once deployers are on the hook, compliance stops being a model company problem and becomes a workflow problem for publishers, brands, agencies, campaign teams, enterprise software teams, and media operations. Imagine 3 common scenarios. Scenario 1. A company adds a support chatbot to its website. If a user is interacting directly with that system, the company needs to think carefully about how and when the AI disclosure happens. You cannot bury the truth in a terms of service link and pretend that counts as good product transparency. Scenario 2. A design tool lets people generate or heavily manipulate images and clips. Now the provider has to think about marking outputs in a machine-readable way, not just about making the generation fast and pretty. Scenario 3. A publisher or campaign team uses AI to generate text or manipulated media about a public interest issue, then pushes it out at scale without real editorial review. That is where deployer obligations get a lot more serious. Now you can see why this is not a narrow legal footnote. It reaches straight into product design. Where exactly does the disclosure appear in a chat interface? Is it obvious on first interaction? Does an AI avatar disclose itself only once, or persistently enough that people are not misled? If your tool generates content through an API, where do the marks get applied? If another team downstream republishes the content, is the label preserved? If your company says there is always a human in the loop, is that actually true? Or is the review so shallow that it barely counts? Those are not philosophy questions. Those are product and operations questions. And this is why I think a lot of teams will get this wrong at first. The easiest mistake is treating transparency as a cosmetic patch, a badge in the corner, a tiny disclaimer, a checkbox in settings, a sentence added by legal after launch. That approach might satisfy an internal slide deck, but it misses the deeper point of the rule, which is to make disclosure meaningful and dependable. The second mistake is thinking only about visible labels. The Commission's materials do talk about labeling, but they also talk about machine-readable marks. That means the transparency idea is not just for human eyes. It is also for systems, platforms, and downstream detection. So if a company only thinks in terms of on-screen wording and ignores the underlying content marking pipeline, it may still have a weak compliance posture. The third mistake is assuming global companies can separate Europe from everywhere else forever. Technically, companies can try to geofence workflows. In practice, that often becomes messy. Products are shared across regions, content gets reposted, APIs serve multiple markets, and teams hate maintaining separate compliance logic when one common standard might be easier. So even companies based outside the EU need to pay attention, especially because the Commission FAQ says providers outside the EU are covered if their system outputs are used in the EU. That sentence should make a lot of product teams sit up, because it means we are not based in Europe is not a serious strategy if your users, customers, or outputs still land there. Another reason this story matters is that it reveals what the next phase of AI competition looks like. For the last couple of years, the attention economy around AI focused on raw capability, smarter models, longer context, better image quality, faster inference, stronger coding, and more agent-like behavior. That race still matters, but regulation like this pushes the market into a second race, operational trust, which companies can build AI systems that are not only impressive, but clearly disclosed, appropriately marked, auditable in practice, and easy for customers to use without stumbling into reputational or regulatory risk. That is a different kind of moat. It favors teams that can connect model capability to product governance, not just labs with strong demos, but platforms with good implementation discipline. And that is why the Commission's Code of Practice is worth paying attention to even though it is voluntary. The Commission says the code can function as an adequate voluntary tool to demonstrate compliance for some of these transparency obligations. That means companies are already being offered a path that is more concrete than vague principle talk. The EU even published icons for labeling AI-generated content. That might sound small, but it is actually revealing. Regulation is moving from abstract policy into interface primitives. Labels, icons, machine-readable marks, review processes, content routing rules. This is the boring infrastructure of trust, and boring infrastructure tends to decide who scales cleanly. There is also an internet culture angle here. For years, platforms and creators lived inside a blurry zone where AI-generated or manipulated content could spread faster than social norms or moderation systems could catch up. Deepfakes, synthetic voices, deceptive edits, and AI-written public interest material all push the internet toward a credibility problem. Article 50 does not solve that problem by itself. Bad actors will still exist. Open tools will still circulate. Enforcement will not be perfect, but the rules do something important. They force at least part of the market to build with transparency in mind from the start instead of treating it as optional cleanup after the fact. That matters culturally because disclosure standards shape expectations. Once users get used to AI labels in one category of products, they start expecting them elsewhere. Once enterprise buyers start asking whether outputs are marked and whether avatars disclose themselves clearly, vendors have to answer. Once publishers map where AI content enters the pipeline, editorial policies stop being theoretical. That is how norms harden, and that is why I would not think of this as a Europe-only story. I would think of it as a preview of how AI products everywhere may have to mature. If you build in this space, the smart move is not panic, it is inventory. Where does your product interact directly with people? Where do you generate or manipulate content? What is visible to end users? What gets published automatically? Where is the human review actually real? And where is it basically fiction? Which outputs keep metadata or marks, and which lose them as soon as they move to another tool? Those questions are now business questions. The winners will not be the teams that write the most heroic press release about responsible AI. They will be the teams that can answer those operational questions clearly and redesign the product where needed. So if you want the simplest version of the story, it is this. The EU AI Act just turned transparency from a principle into product work. Chatbots, AI agents, avatars, generated media, manipulated media, and public interest content workflows now sit closer to compliance than many teams expected. The real challenge is not only building AI that works, it is building AI that declares itself, marks its outputs, survives downstream handling, and fits a publish process that can stand up to scrutiny. That is a big shift, and it tells you where the AI market is heading next. The next serious advantage may not come only from who has the smartest model, it may come from who can combine capability, trust, and operational discipline without making the product miserable to use. August 2, 2026 was the date the roles switched on. August 16, 2026 is the point where more teens are starting to realize this is not someone else's problem. And that is why the EU AI Act just became real work for every chatbot and deepfake workflow.